welcome back, everybody. Welcome also to our friends in Austria who we put this show on the road for. And as you all Austrians and Americans realize, we had a very interesting election week behind ourselves. There has been enormous interest, not only in Austria, but throughout the world in this election. On NPR today, I heard somebody interviewed from Kenya who was commenting on the election and on the authoritarian Trump regime. Anyway, so enormous interest, and of course, all kinds of very interesting issues that are coming up now every day with the president not conceding and not acknowledging the election results. But I don't want to jump ahead of our discussion today. And I'd like to ask again, Jay Hawkes, former director of the Carter Library, to give us sort of the basic election results and how he perceives of the outcome. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Günter. It's really good to be back. I assume we have some repeat people who heard our introduction to the election. And as we predicted, it turned out to be pretty interesting. With a few votes still coming in, Democratic Joe Biden has what appears to be an insurmountable lead, which is based on the fact that he leads by about 5 million popular votes, and that works out to about 3.3 percentage points. And this is better than Hillary Clinton did with the popular vote back in 2016 when she was the Democratic candidate, but not a lot in percentage terms. Biden has a 3 percentage point plus lead, and Hillary was slightly over slightly over 2%. So that difference in the popular vote was enough to flip 4 states, which, if you remember our talk last time about the Electoral College, is really important. And likely there's going to be a 5th state, Georgia, that will flip from the Republican to the Democratic side. And that provides a firm lead in the Electoral College vote, whereas Clinton fell just short in 3 key swing states. We don't know exactly what the Electoral College vote is going to be, but we're pretty close, and it looks like Biden has more than he needs. But it's interesting to note the incumbent president, Donald Trump, received 71.5 million votes so far. That is 5.5 million more than he received last time. In fact, he received the highest vote in US presidential history, except for Joe Biden this time. So we obviously had an election with even what the vote we have in, which is probably 99%, we've had a record turnout on both sides, really rather astounding numbers. And I think it's fair to say that Trump motivated both his supporters and his detractors to cast their ballots. And also, there were huge amounts of money for advertising and organizing, which I believe also helps spur turnout. But we've always argued in political scientists are the low turnouts we usually see in America because people are satisfied or because they're discouraged. And we never could answer that question. So I'm sure we'll be arguing about what this turnout means. But there's a few patterns that are clear. Not surprisingly, women overwhelmingly preferred Biden over Trump, and male voters leaned rather strongly for Trump. So that is a pattern that seems to have settled in. A second pattern is a clear urban-rural divide. And if you picture the US map and say the Democratic states will be blue and the Republican states will be red, you see there's a lot of blue states in the Northeast and sort of down the coast of Virginia, and then down in Georgia, upper Middle West, West Coast, red in the middle. But if you change that to counties, which is a smaller political jurisdiction, all of a sudden that map gets very red with a few pockets of blue. Well, how could the Democrats win if they don't show that much blue? Well, the obvious answer is the rural areas that are sparsely populated went big for Trump, and the urban areas that are densely populated went strong for Biden. So that is an issue in this country. Both sides are very fervent. They don't always talk to each other. So it's kind of easy to see why one group thinks, well, if we lost, there must have been fraud because everybody we know is for our candidate. Or, gee, I can't figure out why we didn't win bigger because everybody I know is for the other candidate. But that's sort of where we are. Now, because there are continuing accusations of fraudulent voting, I'm going to dwell just a minute on absentee and early voting. And this time we have many states that have used mail-in votings for a long time. They can run it rather smoothly. They've been able to practice. There's been no real evidence of fraud. But this year there's been an expansion of absentee ballots. So there's more of them coming in. Some states have done them before, so they don't have the experience and their delays, and they're being extra careful because there's this international spotlight in the election, even in Kenya, where I actually lived for a year. So why is it taking long and what's going on? Well, if you're voting absentee, and I think this is confusing to many here in the United States, let alone around the world, you get your ballot and you get an envelope to put the ballot in. So you take the ballot and you fill in the little circles who you want to vote for, usually in pen. And then you have an envelope that has verifying information, like you put your date of birth, often you put your signature, and often there has to be the signature of a witness. So then you put the ballot in the envelope. Now, when that ballot arrives, they run the ballot through the scanner. But if there's smudges or things like that, it has to then be manually checked. And on the envelope, you might have saw the word date and put in the current date rather than your date of birth, or you forgot to get a witness if that was required. So then that has to also be manually handled. So what will generally happen is there'll be a Democratic official at the table and a Republican official at the table. They usually can agree what the voter wanted to do. And if they don't, maybe it'll get to the court, but usually they can agree, and that the candidates' representatives are sort of around the table at some distance or other. Now, another thing that's not understood in this country is it is now normal, it's become normal this time, to allow voters to cure their ballot. Now, this is not like curing bacon. It's a little bit like curing a disease. If your ballot has a defect, suppose you put in the wrong date, now the registrar of the voting office will contact you and say, you made a mistake, do you want to correct your ballot? And based on the fragmentary evidence that I've seen, there's a very high cure rate so that people do correct their ballots. But although that takes time, it means you're more accurately reflecting the voters, but it also means you can't get out the vote within hours. So that's how that works. And as you see the fraud cases and the argument, I don't want to be overly cynical, but there's a tendency sometimes to say curing must be illegal if they're voting for my opponent, but if they're voting for me, then it's okay. But I think the curing process is relatively fair because as near as I can tell, it's being used pretty universally at this point. Now, one other thing I would point out before turning over to my fellow presenters is despite the loss of the presidency, this election was not terrible for the Republican Party. They did lose the White House, and by pretty convincing margin, but they did gain seats in the House of Representatives. We're going to talk about the Senate later. And they also held many state legislatures that the Democrats had hoped to flip. And after our census that we have this year, we'll be redrawing our congressional lines, and that process will remain largely in the hand of the Republicans. So that's worth noticing. So there are many angles that we could explore and will explore. And I hope your question will cast additional light on the issues that we've forgotten or hadn't had time to mention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shay. I think one might just add the way the election results unfolded is that on the election evening first, what was coming in were the early votes. Now, I voted the first time as a US citizen. I just became a US citizen and I voted early with my wife. So 35 million people voted early. So in the early evening, it looked like Biden might win because many of those voters voted for Biden. And then the election day results came in. And then the map turned very red very quickly. So the president was left on election evening with the impression, I won this thing. But then, of course, the mail-in votes came in. And in this time of COVID, 65 million Americans sent in mail-in votes. Sent in ballots, that is. So that then, of course, in the course of the week, again, threw the race over to the Biden side. And it's particularly those mail-in votes that are being contested by Trump, because he simply doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that so many people voted by mail-in vote. And some of them were counted relatively late, like the state of Pennsylvania only started counting them on the day of the election. That little thing I wanted to add, and now I turn it over to Chris Day, the chair of the political science department at UNO. And Chris, maybe you could talk about two issues. Polling errors, namely that, again, this time around, like during the 2016 election cycle, the polls all seem to suggest it's going to be a blue wave, and then it wasn't. So what went wrong in the polling? That's usually a political science expertise. And number two, could you also address the state of the Senate races? Thank you, Chris. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that.
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Günter, and congratulations on your citizenship. I'm so happy you're voting here in the United States. That's great.
It was a great moment.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, well, the polls, not so wonderful. If there was anything that united Republicans and Democrats in this race, it was that both seemed to revile the public opinion polls afterwards. Republicans because they felt that Republican support had been underestimated, and Democrats because they felt that Republican support had been underestimated. And indeed, it seems so. Why? There have been a lot of problems cited both after 2016 and similar problems after the recent election, and no consensus really. Many problems cited by some pollsters and political observers are rejected by others. And so there's little consensus, but there does seem to be some underestimation of Republican support. Perhaps not as bad as everybody thinks, though, because Biden was predicted to win the presidency, and he did win the presidency. On the other hand, surveys had him pretty consistently about 8 percentage points more than Trump in support nationally, and he actually won the popular vote by about 3 percentage points. State level polls in particular, which are especially important for the Electoral College and for the Senate races, missed the mark largely by underestimating Republican support. And one problem that pretty much all pollsters believe they have, although they don't really know why it might be partisan, but it's cell phones. Cell phones make it difficult to get a representative sample of the population, because when there were landlines, pretty much everybody answered their phone. And so you could randomly call phone numbers and get a pretty representative sample of the population. Now, a lot of people don't answer their cell phones. There's a lot of question among pollsters as to whether surveying online is better than by phone, or whether texting is better than calling. And so there's a lot of soul searching and navel gazing among pollsters regarding how best to do this. Are Republicans more reluctant, or are conservatives more reluctant to answer their phones than liberals are? Haven't really seen any clear evidence of that, but that's one thing I'm sure analysts will be looking at. It does appear that college graduates and urban voters are oversampled in these samples. And so perhaps rural voters and voters with less than a college graduate tend to be underrepresented. And those are two groups that vote pretty heavily for Trump, relatively speaking. So surveyors can correct for this by weighting their samples, but apparently they're not doing a great job of that either. And so the American Association for Public Opinion Research will be looking a lot into these questions. There does seem to be evidence also, I've heard it anecdotally, many pollsters were suggesting this too, that Trump voters may be more reluctant to talk to pollsters. And because they are more likely to believe that pollsters are just another elite, the kind of elites that the President Trump speaks out against. Oh gosh, what we say is going to be manipulated and misrepresented and then ridiculed in the press. There's a fair amount of speculation that these attitudes are more prevalent among Trump voters. And I'm sure there will be some investigation of that as well. Again, just no real consensus what's been going wrong, either 4 years ago or now. But a lot of Senate, Republican Senate candidates, incumbents in particular, that were deemed to be vulnerable and possibly losing their elections, they didn't. They won, and they won by large margins. That includes in Maine, Susan Collins, in Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, in Montana, in a number of states where Republicans were seen as vulnerable, they won. The only two Republican incumbents to lose their seats were ahead by large margins going into the election, and that was those were in Arizona and in Colorado. So the Democrats really thought they would end up with a Senate majority, and maybe they will, maybe they won't, because there are 2 more Senate seats to be decided, both in the state of Georgia. For unusual reasons, usually only 1 seat is up per election, but Georgia has 2 because there is 1 election to fill an interim appointment and another regularly scheduled. Georgia has jungle primaries in which all candidates of all parties run in the same first primary. And if no one gets at over 50% of the vote in the first round, then there's a runoff round. That runoff in Georgia for both seats will be not until January 5th. So we have quite a wait. In fact, the new Congress will be seated on the 3rd, I believe. So just as the new Congress is being seated, there will be 2 runoffs in Georgia. It's going to be close. Georgia was, the presidential election was close in Georgia. The Senate seats will be close. Both parties are going to be pouring lots and lots of money into Georgia. The Democrats could take it. Georgia is a deep red conservative Republican state that is trending, however, blue as the urban areas, especially around Atlanta, grow. And so it's real hard to say who's going to win those 2 elections. I think that Republican incumbency and will be really hard to overcome, both the party and the incumbency factor, but it's not impossible. So if the Democrats win both seats, they'll have 50 in the Senate, and with the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, Democrat, being able to break tie votes, that would give Democrats the advantage. If Republicans win those 2 seats, then they still hold the majority. So that's where the Senate stands. And I'd like to turn it over now to Bobby Dupont to talk about the history of all this.
Thank you, Dr. Day. Our final speaker today is Dr. Robert Dupont, Chair of the History Department, and he'll give us some historical perspective on this election, but maybe, Bobby, you can also talk about the deep divisions in the country, both in the media and in the population, and maybe also about the Republican Party. Is Trump the future of the Republican Party? And if we have time, we can also look a bit into the consequences of the election in the international arena, which might interest our Innsbruck audience, but also with regard to COVID-19. So a lot on your agenda, Dr. Dupont.
Thank you, Günter. I don't think I'll follow my own advice from last time, which was stick to history. What I've tried to do is to identify trends that maybe run against what has happened historically, or I think will have historical importance going forward. I've identified three trends with sort of long-term consequences, and the history in each case suggests that we've hit a bit of a change, an inflection point, if you will, in electoral politics. The first that struck me was the pattern of donations of money. For many elections, Democrats have suffered for a lack of resources, but with online fundraising and the enthusiasm generated by this election, there were astounding amounts of money raised for Democratic candidates, and much of it from very small donations. If this trend continues, it could change elections, I think, in the future. Unfortunately, a lot of the money was put into races that in retrospect, Democrats maybe didn't have that much of a chance. Amy McGrath in Kentucky and Jamie Harrison running against Lindsey Graham. Even the Gideon race versus Collins in Maine, if you add up sort of the surplus donations from all of those candidates and imagine that it could have gone to other candidates, or maybe the race would be closer, things might have changed, but it's very hard to do sort of triage on candidates. And if they're good at fundraising, as Harrison was, we're talking here, I think, 100 million or so for Harrison. So that's the one thing that struck me is the change sort of in pattern of donations. A second change, and this one I think will get a lot of publicity going forward. There are already fights within the Democratic Party about this. The famous American comedian Will Rogers once said, "I don't belong to any organized political party, I'm a Democrat." And so the Democrats are known for their sort of fighting with each other, if you will. But in this case, it's a serious trend, and that is that the Latino vote in this election went for Trump at a slightly higher rate, not astoundingly, but a slightly higher rate than it did in 2016. This is important because going forward, Latinos would be the largest minority group in the country. And so the issue of those votes, I think, are going to be quite important. Now, without going into a lot of the literature of it, historians study assimilation patterns. And one of the assimilation patterns is that as people become more and more sort of acculturated to American behaviors, they tend to maybe vote a bit more conservative over time. In particular with the Latino community, and I don't want to overemphasize this, but I think it's important. It is one way of signifying your whiteness, and that is to vote conservative or to vote Republican. And so for those Latinos who want to sort of make a statement, in effect, distinguishing themselves from African Americans, one way to do this is to tend toward the Republican side. And so sort of watch the newspapers, because that's going to be big news over the next year or so for the Democrats. And the third trend, and I'll have more to say about this in a minute, but the third trend is the persistence of certain determinants. Dr. Hakes has already mentioned a bit of this. Party identification, education, and where you live, geography, were the biggest determinants or the most likely determinants of your vote. Now, I'll mention that list again. It's party identification. How do you see yourself? What is your education? Rural versus urban. Now, some of this overlaps with issues, but a lot of it does not. And so this sort of ideal model out there of a voter who looks over the issues and selects on the basis of preferences and then picks candidates or parties that model, I don't think works for us. And so what I've posed here are sort of a set of brief questions about sort of the future. And it wraps some of this in and some of which you've already heard from other speakers. And the first really relates to what I just said, and that is there's an astounding disconnect between policy preferences and the choice of party and candidate. Let's take just one quick example from Florida. In the midst of voting for a very conservative candidate and voting Republican, very red state and so on, and Cuban vote in Miami, Miami-Dade didn't flip, but it went a little bit more for Trump. In the midst of all of that, Florida voters also approved a $15 minimum wage increase. So this is a fairly liberal position, and yet their voting didn't really reflect that. They were able to vote directly on that proposal, but when it came to picking political candidates, it's as if they forgot what they wanted in terms of economic policy. There's also a disconnect between the two, what I'm going to call tribes. The identification in the social and cultural sense with certain groups. In one case, you have a group that at least purports to be rational, pro-enlightenment, educated, pro-science, diverse, urban. And the other tribe, anti-science, evangelical for the most part, armed, most likely to have guns, mostly white. And these two tribes just simply don't speak to each other. I mentioned this a bit last time. And to sort of check myself, I literally made a list of sort of my own circle, if you will. And these are colleagues from the university and friends and family. And in my case, it's a large family. And when I got to about 80 or 90 people, I realized that there were only two that I could identify as Trump voters, and one of whom I don't speak to. We communicate mostly through Facebook. And the other's a brother-in-law, ex-military, and we don't talk politics at all. But that's two out of maybe 80 or 90 people. The fact is that we live in our own worlds. And I think going forward, this is a challenge for politicians to how to break through these sort of bubbles and so on. This is personified in sort of a cliche that's going around right now, where they're talking about Whole Foods counties and Cracker Barrel counties. And the distinguishing thing here, of course, is that Whole Foods are urban and diverse and expensive, almost always associated with upper middle class. Cracker Barrel are rural, and so you can actually count the vote percentages in each type of county. And you'll see this again in the news a lot over the next few months and beyond, and that is how does one sort of talk to the other? It hasn't come up today, at least much. I mentioned just a little bit, but also the last thing is sort of a question for the future is a persistent question in American politics and American society, and that is how does the concept of race overlay all of what we've talked about? When one says Trump voters are rural and therefore anti-urban, that is also a proxy for often saying anti-African American. And since America has this 100, 200-year dilemma of how to deal with race, it's not going away. We've just talked about it in different ways, anti-urban, pro-law enforcement, and so on. And I think we're not probably going to get out of that until there's a great deal more conversation. Günter asked me to say something about international. Günter, I'll take just a moment to do that if I could.
Yeah.
Biden has already indicated that he'll rejoin the Paris Pact on climate, that he'll rejoin the World Health Organization. So I think in the short term, you'll see a lot of sort of trying to slowly reverse the international trends, the anti-NATO stand and so on that Trump had. Some of this is going to be very difficult. The Iranians have also already announced that they're skeptical. And I don't know how all this will go, but it's pretty clear that I think Biden's going to have a residue of goodwill in the international community. There are some exceptions to this, of course. The people that have been very close to Trump, the Russians have already weighed in on this election controversy on Trump's side. But I think in general, on issues of trade, defense policy, arms control, you'll see a great deal more multilateralism than you did under Trump, who claimed that America first and almost nothing else counted. I hope that helps as an introduction, Günter, and I think there were other things you asked that I probably didn't hit, but we'll leave that for questions, okay?
Okay, thank you very much, Bobby. Just a quick comment and then a question to the entire panel, and then we're going to throw it open for questions. The comment is this: I'm very glad that you brought up the Latino vote. The way I've seen it discussed in much of the commentary so far is that what was surprising is that the Latino vote is no longer monolithic. That in Miami-Dade, that is in South Florida, there is a lot of Cubans, Colombians, Venezuelans, and they sort of went on Trump's rhetoric against Biden being a socialist and voted for Trump. In the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, apparently a lot of inroads were made by Trump with Latino voters there, and they would more likely be Mexicans and Central Americans. Whereas I understand that in Arizona and in Nevada, the Latinos went more for Biden, and those, of course, would also be Mexicans and Central Americans. So I think political scientists will spend much more attention to the Latino vote and the fact that it's no longer monolithic. And here now the question for all three of you, and whoever wants to answer can answer it. If you look into the future, Americans are very quickly going to think about the 2022 election and 2024 election. And one hears a lot these days that Trump, if he ever is going to concede, then wants to position himself for 2024, potentially running again. That is, he will be even older than Joe Biden if he's still with us. So how do you see the future in terms of electoral politics, any of you?
Well, I think there's a fairly clear pattern if you go back in history that generally the president's party loses in the legislature the next election. Bill Clinton suffered a devastating loss in 1994. George Bush didn't in 2002, largely because of 9/11. But Obama had a big setback in 2010. So just if you took history as a guide, which I'm not sure is necessarily the way to look at it, you would expect maybe some additional Republican gains in the House. Another thing about this election that maybe was overlooked, although we've kind of known it all along, is that Americans kind of like divided government. So they were prepared to vote for Nancy Pelosi's party in 2018 because it was a check on Trump. But if the Democrats are going to have the presidency, maybe then they're not so comfortable with Nancy Pelosi controlling the House. That's certainly one way to look at it. Now, there's another side of that coin in that usually presidents have coattails down the ballot, and Biden didn't really help the Democrats down the ballot like was expected. He carried Maine very convincingly, and then Susan Collins, the Republican incumbent senator, won by, I believe, 8 points, which showed that voters knew what they were doing. They split their ballot, and even though they had very different policy positions, that's how they voted. So I think the next time will be a little hard to predict, but it will be decisive because the Obama and Clinton presidencies were really held back by the results of that next election, and they never really recovered from it in terms of being able to get their policies into place. They had to revert back to executive orders and regulations rather than legislation.
Thank you, Jay. Chris or Bobby, you want to chime in on that?
I'll just answer the other question you had, and that was Trump in 24. personally, I'm a bit skeptical. I'm not even sure when he reflects upon it that he's enjoyed being president. It's work he doesn't like. It's hard work. Witness a number of times he played golf instead. And so, 3 or 4 years down the line, when the time comes, he's got to make a decision. Even if he's announced prior to that he's going to run, I'm a little bit skeptical. And I think that there's a backlog of ambitious Republicans waiting to jump into that race. So the intra-party fighting might be even worse in 24. So I don't think so, but I don't put it beyond him.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dupont. Chris, you want to add anything?
You have to
Again, unmute, yeah.
I think he's right. Am I unmuted?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're good, yeah.
I think he's right. And as to the question of whether Trumpism will remain dominant in the Republican Party or a major stream within the Republican Party, that one is a really hard question to answer. I think it will be a faction of the Republican Party. He does, I agree with Bobby, but at the same time, I think he will continue to hold rallies. He loves the adoration. He loves the crowds. He has started a PAC for supporting Republican candidates who are behind him. And one question is whether Republicans in Congress will remain so loyal to Trump as they have, because there are a lot of Republican outside of Congress, other state and local leaders, columnists, and other types of leaders who have been absolutely appalled by Trump as a person. And so the party is going to remain very divided, and I think he will not be that influential within the party once he's out of the White House. But the Republican Party will continue to have to contend with the fairly large number of Republican constituents around the country who are huge fans of President Trump. Many say he was sent by God, and this will continue to be a factor.
Thank you.
Let me also add very quickly, if I can, we don't know the future of his legal situation.
That's right.
At least a possibility that some of the legalities will come back to haunt him over this time.
That's very true. And if he is, he could possibly try to pardon himself while he's still in office. But even if he tried to do that, which is constitutionally questionable, the president can pardon people without being checked of federal crimes. Can a president pardon himself? Not sure. But even if he were to do that, he cannot pardon himself of state crimes. And the state of New York is investigating a number of potential charges of financial fraud and so on. So tax fraud.
Thank you, Dr. Day. I think the deep division of the Republican Party is also indicated through the Lincoln Project, which was a bunch of really Republican pollsters and so forth, Republican campaign advisors from former campaigns who turned against Trump and raised $70 million to sort of advertise against Trump in crucial battleground states. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether they will be reunited with the party once Trump is no longer the dominant force that he is. So ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to throw it open for our audience to ask questions. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Christian Stenico, who again will manage the questions, particularly if they come in from Innsbruck. Chris.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, if you could just type your questions or type that you have a question, and you have to mute yourself, otherwise it Okay. Oh. Yeah, we have a. I'll move into the other house. Okay, we already have a question from Eva Knabel from Innsbruck. And could you please unmute yourself and just ask your question to the panel?
Yeah, you talked about the deep division of these, like you called it, two tribes. And I was wondering if Biden is going to do something about it, or better said, what can he do about it? Or is it the fact that he won dividing the nation even more?
Well, you know, that is the big question that's going to deeply affect both the Biden presidency and the future of the country. On the plus side, in my opinion, Biden is very popular with his fellow senators, or he used to be a senator, and even the Republicans like him a lot and have worked with him in the past. But I don't think that guarantees that you get over this divide that Professor Dupont talked about. It's very deep. It has almost religious overtones to it in some cases, and we'll have to see. I think if Biden gets a break with the pandemic going away and the economy growing, that this will sort of strengthen his position to do a lot of things. But he's not an orator. He's kind of a behind-the-scenes deal maker, although his speaking's gotten better. So I have to say that I can argue both sides of that, but it's a heavy lift because this divide is very deep out there with the voters.
Let me add something quickly. There have been some suggestion that there are, in spite of what I said earlier, some policy matters that he might take up very quickly. One that I've read that's intriguing is sort of a project to make sure broadband internet reaches all of the rural areas of the country, different kinds of infrastructure, different kinds of income support policies that might be able to break through to this sort of non-college educated electorate. But I agree with Professor Hakes. It's going to be a very heavy lift for anybody.
Just to add on a little bit, I think the broadband issue is interesting because I think that's the kind of issue the Democrats need to talk about. And for instance, when they talk about climate change, they don't talk enough about the impacts on agriculture, which is something that affects these rural communities, because a lot of the Democrats live near the coast and they're interested in, as they should be, in sea level rise. But if they think about it, and the president can't do it all by himself, other Democrats have to start being more sensitive to issues like broadband, adverse effects on agriculture, adverse effects on rural hospitals from the overturning of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. So the Democrats are going to have to work on their messaging, but boy, it's going to be tough.
Thank you, everyone. The next question is by Severin William. Could you please unmute yourself?
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is regarding Joe Biden. I have an acquaintance who claims to have friends in the American government, and he says that there are claims or rumors that Joe Biden has dementia and therefore could be impeached due to being unfit to be a president. And I was just wondering if there's any truth to it, if you guys have any information about that, and if that would be the case, what a Kamala Harris presidency would mean for the United States of America.
Well,
I haven't heard anything about that.
I would say that having worked in several presidential campaigns, that it'd be pretty hard to run for president and hide your dementia. I mean, for instance, you're out on the debate stage for an hour and a half, and people can ask you questions on anything, and you have to have fairly instant recall. I think people, as they get older, it takes them a little longer to recall sometimes because they've got more in the file cabinet. But the other thing I would say, that I think you can assure them that there will still be the 2/3 revote for the conviction for any impeachment in the Senate. And one could not really imagine that an impeachment strategy against Biden would be successful on something like that.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that.
Okay, the next question is by Sanja Kwentner. Could you unmute yourself?
Hello. Yes, my question is, because Trump refuses to acknowledge the election, can he still be a danger to Biden, and has he any legal basis to turn the election in his favor? And how likely is it that until the 20th January, you still have no precedent?
Well, in a legal sense, there's no question. Trump is the president until January 20th. But as the Constitution reads, at noon on that day, he ceases to be. I expect that between now and maybe the next week or so, most of the court cases will be resolved, probably by being dismissed. I think that Trump will very, very grudgingly admit in private that he's lost, but I don't expect a concession speech or any kind of graciousness on his part. The Electoral College meets in December to certify the election, and once that's done, there's really no way out for Trump. The most plausible scenario I've seen is that he moves to Mar-a-Lago sometime in December, ignores the government and ignores his predecessor. He'll probably grudgingly agree that his administration should help with the transition. But there's at least the plausible chance that he won't take part in the inauguration or in any of the gestures that are sort of normal toward an incoming president.
I even read this morning that the law firms representing the president in his lawsuits about supposed electoral fraud are terribly divided within, and a lot of the lawyers within these firms objecting to representing these cases, saying that it's basically forcing them to go against the rule of law because there's little to no evidence of the kind of fraud that the president is suing for. So I think Bobby Dupont is correct that these lawsuits will be fairly quickly dismissed.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think it's significant that 4 Republican senators have already said that they think Biden won the election. So if somehow it went to the Senate, which has some role after the secretaries of state submit the electors, I think, to the head of the National Archives, and it goes through all this process, I don't see at what point Trump could stop it. And also the lawsuits, even if they were successful, don't affect enough votes to change the outcome. So I think what's going on is more to sow doubts in the minds of the American people about the election so that they can believe that Trump didn't really lose. We had a civil war here a long time ago. And after that, the losing side always talked about the lost cause, and it motivated people for a long time, in some ways still does. And I think that the Trump supporters are going to view this as the lost cause that was stolen from them, even if the courts and the system indicate otherwise.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next, Manuel Dobsch has a question from Innsbruck. Manuel, you have to unmute yourself.
There we go. All right. I wanted to ask about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, actually, because we have seen this big scene when Trump stepped out, basically in the middle of counting the votes, and said, and actually we did win the election, right? And I think, what do you think about the increase or decrease of people who like the idea of actually giving the win to the popular vote winner in the end? will this the outcome and the whole campaign before the public election this year change the perspective of American people on this idea of the popular vote winner immediately becoming the actual winner of the election?
No.
Go ahead, Chris, please.
Well, I was just going to say, as long as the Electoral College is perceived as favoring one party or another, the party that's perceived to be favored, and currently that's the Republicans, will fight against any change. If that were to change to a perceived advantage for the Democrats, then the Democrats would fight it. But it's a very partisan issue, and I just don't foresee any change in the Electoral College. A lot of states have decided to send electors to the Electoral College in proportion to the vote in their state. But again, those states are all Democratic states. So it really, even that wouldn't happen without consensus among the states, whether Democrat or Republican. So I think we're stuck with the Electoral College for the foreseeable future.
The count is an interesting way around the constitutional barriers, because that can be done by majority vote state by state. I don't remember how many states have signed on. It's not insignificant, but it's not near a majority yet. And the states who've signed on have a provision that says this won't go into effect for our state unless a majority of the states sort of sign on. So I think it may remain popular in sort of a good government sense, but I think Chris is right. When you finally get down to it, I think the Republicans in most of the states are going to fight it because of a perceived disadvantage. It is a clever idea, though, I think.
Okay, thank you. For the next question, please, Marina Schandl, unmute yourself.
So I have a quick question, actually. How much damage can Trump still do to Biden, regardless of how much longer he drags out his legal cases? Because if I understand it right, he and his people are actually sort of obstructing the transition of power. And how much damage can that do to Biden's administration if he doesn't comply with the transition before the inauguration or sometime there?
You know, my biggest worry about the transition is the threat to the rule of law. If there are massive amounts of pardons for people where there have been criminal investigations or charges, because this is sort of a threat to the future rule of law. If people think that they're well served by fighting the law and supporting a president who has the pardon power. But I think your question addresses most directly the transition process, and that's been set up so that it's a smooth handoff. And that has been a big story the last day or two, because the Trump administration has failed to provide the assistance, the access to documents and the provision of office space, all of which is provided by law. I don't worry about that quite so much, because the Biden people have been around before. They know how government worked. A lot of them have worked in the agencies. A number of them have already worked at the White House. So while it's inconvenient, I could argue it's unpatriotic to delay this transition process. I still think the Biden people on January 20th, they're going to be pretty ready to hit the ground running.
You asked the question in terms of the damage to Biden, and I suppose by extension to the country. My biggest concerns are in the area of foreign policy. I mean, some of this is happening already. The sort of sale of extraordinary amount of arms to the UAE, other decisions that normally a president on his way out might defer to the incumbent president. I think Trump will go his own way, regardless of the damage to the country. Ironically, this might end up helping Biden if Trump is sort of shown to be quite petty or works against the rule of law. But I think it is a concern of most people who are observing what's going on.
Thank you. Marina just said thank you for answering her question. Okay, and I think this last, the next question might be our last question because we're approaching the 1 hour limit. Brigitte Petrovic, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
My question is, what about the Afro-American voters? Is there, can you make out the same trend as for the Latino voters, that they will be more voting for the Republican Party? Are there any statistics?
African American voters still were voting heavily for the Democratic candidates, but there was a widened gender gap among Blacks, as among Latinos, actually. The gender gap among Blacks and Latinos was actually wider than the gender gap among white people, with women more likely to support Biden and Democratic candidates, but especially in the presidential election. But African Americans are still very heavily Democratic voters.
Thank you.
Günter Bischof just said we have time for another question. So Lea Kühne, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for your time. So my question is actually pretty similar to Sonia's question earlier, but I just wanted to clarify because there are still uncounted votes. And I heard from several people that they are a little bit concerned about what happens on December 14th when the Electoral College meets and the votes are still uncounted. And I wonder if there really is a real chance that these worries are justified to consider, or is it really just Trump supporters holding on to the possibility that Trump might still win?
Well, I would say there are 3 different paths for Biden to get to the 270 electoral votes he needs. One is Pennsylvania. That does it. If that didn't work out, he's got the Nevada, Arizona path, and that provides enough votes, and those states have been declared. And then there's another path that would include Georgia. So the ways to get to the 270 are multiple. And we do know from history that when there are recounts, which there will be in Georgia, maybe someplace else, but probably not, it doesn't change that many votes because they've gone through this in a very systematic way. So it just, and I think the lawyers arguing the case is, I think it was Professor Day said, the law firms are getting a little upset with this because they're ruining their reputation if they engage in what is called a frivolous lawsuit, one that's just submitted to mess up the process. And there's been no evidence of fraud. You know, you go around looking for fraud. Usually when you investigate something, there's some probable cause to think there's a problem. But at this point, there's been no evidence. Now on social media or some extreme channels, there may be someone made up a film of somebody burning ballots or something. But in the real world that we live in, there doesn't seem to be any evidence. So I think the way to block this is I don't see how it could be done. I do see how they could rile up a lot of people and make them mad, but not overturn the election.
Günter, before we sign off, you had asked earlier about COVID, and it may be worth a quick mention that Biden has jumped on that issue very, very quickly. He's already named a scientific panel that will advise him about it. He's setting a good example. I think more than anything else, his goodwill as he starts will depend very much on whether we can sort of get this under control within a few months of his inauguration. So that's to answer an early question that you had.
Günter, you're still on mute.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we want to conclude it with this final statement by Dr. Dupont. It just remains for me to thank all the participants. Number one, Dr. Jay Hakes, Dr. Christine Day, Dr. Robert Dupont for their expertise in making the statements they did and answering the questions as knowledgeably as they did. I'd also like my collaborators, thank my collaborators here at Center Austria for figuring out the technical issues, which is Christian Stenico and Mark Landry and also Gertrud Griesner. And then finally, I'd like to thank our partners in Innsbruck, particularly Cornelia Klicker for helping us to set this up and showing interest in such a video kind of a seminar. And I also want to thank the students who asked, from my perspective, remarkably smart questions. And I might add, I taught an American history course at the University of Innsbruck as a guest professor this spring. And I was surprised in the papers that the students had to write how good their writing in English is. And I'm now again surprised how good and smart their questioning in English is. So I asked a teacher friend of mine in Bregenz, why are today's students so good in English? And she had a very simple answer, which surprised me, but it makes sense. She said, oh, this is the Netflix generation. Apparently all of you watch as much Netflix as my own kids do. And that is really making your English almost perfect from my perspective. So I think Cornelia Klicker in Innsbruck, you can be very proud of your kids in your class, the way they ask questions, very smart. And we hope we can do this in another context again in the future. So thank you all for participating and for making this possible. And tschüss, auf Wiedersehen an alle. Vielen Dank, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Günter.
Thank you.